All right. To some extent, this whole story has to dovetail inevitably with the Cold War. It's not that they're separate subjects exactly. I mean, they intersect in fascinating ways. But you could also chalk up this entire period in history, even something like the Chinese Civil War, to a kind of decolonization. I mean, after all, when Mao took power, if we remember from last week, Chiang Kai-shek and his forces, the Kuomintang, fled to Taiwan. They hadn't just been backed by the Americans and the West writ large. To some extent, they'd even been backed by the Soviets. Mao, remember, had not really been Stalin's first choice. I mean, Stalin would have been happy to see China divided. So part of what gave Mao his momentum was this whole impetus, this thing I talked about last week. The best word for it, I think, is hesperophobia, just this idea of an almost reaction, a lashing back at the West against foreigners, which in China would basically assume extreme forms by the 1960s in the course of the Cultural Revolution. But that's next week's subject. You could chalk up a lot of these other stories, too, to the Cold War, or you could see them as part of the story of decolonization. Cuba would be a good example, where, of course, we know the drama of the Cuban Missile Crisis. But to some extent, the Castro phenomenon, again, represented a casting off of the West, or at least of the Americans. It's true he went in with the Soviets, and so he didn't become non-aligned like some of these other would-be dictators at the Bandung Conference. But there was an element of an anti-Western impulse there. Now, it was usually the case that even the non-aligned countries, I mean, eventually, you didn't have to take sides in the sense you didn't have to absolutely officially say, I am on the communist side or I'm on the American side in the Cold War. But usually momentum would push you in one direction or the other. And for the most part, the anti-colonial direction would push you into the Soviet camp. Which, again, when you first think about it, should be ironic because America was the great anti-imperial power. That's how it saw itself. America did not like the British and French empires. America, as we just saw, basically stood up to Britain and France at Suez. That said, it was more often true than not that the anti-American side in the Cold War, the anti-Western side, would just end up on the Soviet side either by default or, of course, because it wanted the weapons or it wanted the financing. I mean, to some extent, the Cold War, it was a boom time, for would-be guerrilla leaders and tin pot dictators everywhere. Because just think of the rewards if you went on the payroll. I mean, Cuba, by the end of the 1980s, was getting almost $5 billion a year from the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union, mind you. A basket case of a country that had no toilet paper. They were sending the Cubans $5 billion a year. I mean, it's an extraordinary commitment of resources and prestige. But that's what the Cold War was like. Massive excess and waste on both sides. When you think about the cost of putting a man on the moon, it was insane. It made no logical sense. It was all about, prestige. To some extent, all these proxy battles were like that, too. They didn't start that way, though. There are a lot of different ground we could cover, ground we could skip. I mean, I'll just focus on some of the key countries, because after all, we can't focus on everything. Vietnam, obviously, being a biggie. Now, Vietnam, again, was part of a French colony. The French, of course, called it Indochine, or Indochina. It was not split into these three countries we know today of Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia until 1950, and then by the French, who were trying to kind of reclassify everything in order to shore up the administrative, you might say, oomph of their empire, to try to legitimize these states as part of the French, their own version of the Commonwealth. It wasn't going well, though. Ho Chi Minh was there. Again, perched mostly in the north, in Hanoi, later Ho Chi Minh City, or no, that's Saigon, sorry, in Hanoi. So Ho Chi Minh is up there in the north. He's pretty much in the communist side. Again, the debate was, to what extent is he just a nationalist guerrilla leader who wants to kick out the West? To what extent is he a committed communist? Well, you could come down, on both sides. You could say, yes, his main goal was to kick the West, quote-unquote, out of his country, meaning the French. On the other hand, the man had visited Moscow on a number of official occasions and was essentially a card-carrying communist, at least nominally. So that, yes, the war did develop into a proxy war. Initially, it was a war between the French and the North Vietnamese, except the North Vietnamese, of course, were getting weapons from the Soviets and the Chinese. In fact, it was with Soviet anti-aircraft weapons and artillery that they won the famous Battle of Dien Bien Phu against France in 1954. Now, America's commitment began in kind of the most offhanded way. It was part of the same phenomenon in this era of Britain and France slowly disengaging, or more to the point, not wishing to disengage and hoping that the Americans would help to prop them up. France couldn't afford this commitment. France wanted it for reasons of prestige, tradition, authority, etc., but they couldn't pay for it. And so gradually the Americans started to pay. By about 1953-54, they're paying over 80% of the French war effort. Now, they are also, of course, sending the French arms that they're buying and that sort of thing. But they're also just paying for the whole campaign. And getting, of course, it's a great, I think, insight into human psychology. They say that to make someone really love you, you don't do them a favor, you have them do you a favor. And the reason is because gratitude grates. People resent you if you do them favors. One of the reasons the French hate the Americans today, or at least pretend like they hate the Americans, because they don't like being reminded about how the Americans liberated France in the Second World War, how the Americans sent all this money and arms to help the France in Vietnam. The French, they also had an interesting point about this. I doubt many of you have seen Apocalypse Now, because it's probably before your time. You've heard of it. Well, okay, that's something. Yeah, based loosely on the Joseph Conrad novel, Heart of Darkness, transplanted from the 19th century into Vietnam. Famous movie with Marlon Brando playing a totally Looney Tunes American officer who's kind of gone off the reservation, set up a cult to himself and all of this. Martin Sheen is in the movie, father of Charlie Sheen, who I guess is more famous today. Well, if you haven't seen the movie, I'm not going to tell you the plot. I'll just tell you about one scene, which interestingly enough is not in the original version. It's in the uncut version, the director's cut released later. But that won't make any difference to you because you haven't seen either. But anyway, so here's the scene. The Americans are on this boat. They're going up the river delta trying to track down this Looney Tunes American who's gone off the reservation. They stop along the side one day. There's a great French estate, seemingly like in the middle of nowhere. It's like France plopped down in the middle of Indochina, which is kind of a nice description of French imperialism. Right down to like, the Louis XVI armoires and, the furniture and the cuisine and everything. Anyway, they're invited in for dinner. And, of course, Martin Sheen seduces a French woman, but that's not the point of the scene. The point of the scene is he talks with the patriarch. They have this intense conversation over the dinner table. And it goes something like this. The Frenchman said, "You Americans, what are you doing here in Vietnam? You see, we Frenchmen, when we here, we fight. What do we fight for? We fight for this." He shows them all the furniture, all of the food, the proper porcelain dishes, the traditions, the rituals. This is what we fight for. You fight for what? To stop communism? Why? It makes no sense, you Americans. You fight for abstraction. We fight for our homes. The guy had a point. The French were there, well, because they were there. I mean, to a certain extent, it no longer mattered why they were there. The fact was they were there and they wanted to stay. The Americans fought because the French had been there, which made a lot less sense. America had never had any connection to the place, didn't have a very important trading relationship with the place. America really had no particular interests in the place. I suppose eventually Americans got to like Vietnamese restaurants, but that was like after the fact. That was after all the Vietnamese went to America. There was no connection. It just didn't really make a whole lot of sense. They were there because the French were there, and then the French lost, and the Americans were just kind of stuck. And because it had turned into a Cold War battleground. Because Ho Chi Minh was, at least avowedly speaking, a communist. So here's the crux. After Dien Bien Phu, the French have to sign a ceasefire. They partition the country, not unlike Korea. Here it's the 17th parallel, it's a little further south in Korea. They're supposed to have elections to possibly reunite the country, like a plebiscite to see what the people want in 1956. Now, a key decision, probably the key decision, was that the Americans did not allow the elections to take place. Ironic in that Americans are always talking about democracy, you know. They didn't for a very simple reason, because they knew Ho Chi Minh was going to win. Because he was the big hero who had kicked the French butt. So that even people in the South who didn't really want to live under communism, they still sort of admired the guy. You know, he was the leading figure of the country. Now, he had name recognition, he had a military reputation, he would almost certainly win the national elections under some kind of platform of unifying the country under communist rule, which the Americans didn't want, of course, because it had turned into a kind of Cold War proxy battleground. And so the Americans began shoring up the South, much like they were doing at the same time in Korea, you know, into a kind of, you know, legitimate state. Again, a little bit like West Germany. It was never the original plan to have a state called West Germany. It happened because the Americans needed to bring the Germans into the fold in the Cold War. Same thing with Vietnam, same thing with Korea. So they began establishing a government in the South, where the French had had their main base, you know, down in Saigon. And the Americans slowly begin to take over. You know, they send more people there. They're not sending troops. You know, it's more like they're sending diplomats, you know, advisors. Yes, a few businessmen. And these things always snowball. You know, once you have a few Americans, then you need someone else to, you know, sell them Coca-Cola or whatever, someone else to bring the whiskey. So eventually you get the distributors, you get the kind of presence which snowballs, it eventually becomes something like an imperial commitment. Now, there's a lot of controversy even in American kind of political history about this. There's a famous movie directed by Oliver Stone called JFK, where he proposes it's this preposterous conspiracy theory about the assassination of JFK. You know, his idea is that everyone was involved, even the vice president. You know, and they killed him because he was going to keep America out of Vietnam or something like that. It's very, very silly because JFK actually did a lot more than Eisenhower had done to commit America to Vietnam. Not as much as his successor, LBJ, would do. It was kind of a gradual process. They had a few thousand advisors on the ground by the time of, you know, Eisenhower stepping down in 1960. There was an interesting political moment, though. Eisenhower gave this speech, essentially his farewell address, only slightly less famous than that of George Washington, who talked about not wanting America to get into entangling alliances. Eisenhower spoke of what he called the military-industrial complex. What he meant by this was that he was beginning to be worried that American foreign policy was not just being manipulated by, you know, foreign ethnic groups, but by a kind of almost military-industrial lobby, you know, who always wanted greater military spending, and they wanted greater commitments in the Cold War because it meant contracts for them. You know, it meant money. So some people think that had Eisenhower and his policies continued, America would have stayed out of Vietnam. It's interesting. I mean, there's evidence on both sides of the ledger. Eisenhower very clearly stated that America had no strategic interest in Vietnam. He did not want America to get more deeply involved. On the other hand, he was also the first president to talk about this idea of falling dominoes. Dominoes being, you know, it's like this child's game. You stack them up on the table, you push one, and the others all fall down. The idea being, again, if one country will become communist, the others will presumably follow. So you don't want to have one country infected with communism, then all the other ones in the region, you know, then Thailand and Laos, and eventually maybe Burma, and maybe even India. They'll all go communist. That's the idea. You know, in retrospect, it seems kind of silly. But, you know, at the time, that is what people were worried about. It was the Cold War. You know, the map is being colored communist, or it's being colored, they didn't really have colors, but I mean, that's, you know, it's either communist or it's, you know, first world, American-dominated capitalist world. That's the way people were thinking. Eisenhower was probably sensible enough to keep the Americans out. JFK was not quite as sensible as Eisenhower. He wasn't, however, completely crazy. He didn't really send vast numbers of troops to Vietnam. He did, however, curiously, it seems, we don't have concrete proof, but it seems that he may have approved, weirdly, the assassination of Ngo Dinh Diem, who was supposed to be America's man on the ground in South Vietnam, who was, oddly enough, assassinated shortly before JFK himself was assassinated in November 1963. I've never really understood why. He was certainly corrupt, and he was bad news, and his administration, you know, treated political opponents rather brutally. I mean, the normal things you expect in a kind of corrupt dictatorship like this. the Americans, I think as usual, had decided that they wanted to wash their hands of a problem without thinking entirely through what would follow. His administration may have been corrupt, but at least they were still running the place. America's involvement, that is, was beginning to deepen slowly. We shouldn't blame this all on the Americans, though. In any war, of course, there are two sides. And beginning back in about 1957, right when they had first put Diem in power, Ho Chi Minh had set up an organization famously called the Viet Cong. This was like the sort of unofficial, paramilitary guerrilla army of the North, which expressly aimed to infiltrate the South. And so that's what they literally would do. They would smuggle arms and men across the border. They would attack military installations. It was like a low-grade civil war. It hadn't yet completely boiled over into full-on armed conflict yet. But the war was basically on. So the Americans, they're sort of not fighting a war which already exists. The North is already fighting it. The Americans are hesitating before jumping in. A couple of things intervened, which I think eventually crystallized the American intervention there. The Diem assassination probably didn't help because it kind of screwed up the government in the South. It weakened the government morale in the military. But the main thing was actually what happened back in America. JFK was assassinated, of course, in 1963. He's succeeded by a man I like to call Lyndon Baines Chicken Shit Johnson. The reason I call him Chicken Shit is because of his speech, which actually had to do with Vietnam. Now, oddly enough, he was actually interviewed by a historian. Well, she would later become a historian. At the time, she was a journalist, called Doris Kearns Goodwin, a very famous historian. And when she interviewed him, she asked him what his thinking was when he first began committing serious numbers of troops to Vietnam. Let's see. He said, if I can get the quote right, he said that what had happened when we lost China, which is to say the era I talked about last week with McCarthy and a kind of almost anti-communist hysteria, which although there was real communist infiltration in the government, the hysteria had spread to Hollywood and all of these other places. He said that what happened in the Who Lost China debate would be chicken shit compared to what would happen if we lost Vietnam. Now, what he meant by this was something specific to partisan politics. LBJ, like JFK, unlike Eisenhower, and like Truman, was, of course, a Democrat. Eisenhower was the Republican in between all of these Democratic administrations. It was basically a Democratic era in American politics. Eisenhower was like the exception to the rule. FDR, Democrat, had been president for almost 4 terms. Truman for another almost 2 terms. Then there was kind of an Eisenhower interregnum, made possible really mostly because Eisenhower was a military hero, who was not really a strict partisan politician at all. He was more like a kind of grandfatherly figure that everyone respected as the architect of the victory over Germany on the Western Front. And then the Democratic rule kind of resumed and continued until 1968 when Nixon finally broke the momentum. Well, anyway, so the Democrats, if you go back even further, the Republicans had had that period in the 1920s when they had dominated politics. But even before that, there had been Wilson. It reminds me a little bit of, there's a famous speech by Bob Dole, who lost to Clinton in 1996. Sort of bitter, defeated figure. And he famously used to rail against what he called Democrat wars. Now, what he meant by this was interesting. The Democrats tended to run for office in times of international crisis, like the First World War and the Second, on the promise that they kept America out of the war, like Wilson did in 1916, like FDR did in 1940. And then the very next year, FDR entered the Second World War. The very next year, Woodrow Wilson entered the First World War. In very similar fashion, LBJ campaigned in 1964 for re-election. His first election, in the sense he only became president because FDR was killed in 1963. Very much on this campaign platform of, we'll keep you out of this war in Vietnam. And then, of course, the very next year, America entered the war. Now, some of this had to do with his domestic agenda. He was a Democrat. He was from Texas, so he wasn't like the most crazy left liberal of Democrats. But still, he had a domestic agenda which was very liberal. Extreme, kind of social spending, the welfare state as he saw it. He needed political capital for this. And as he saw it, his whole program would get tarnished, as, again, the work of the unpatriotic left unless he could shore up his credentials with, shall we say, a popular war. This a political dynamic which never completely goes away. I'm reminded, of course, of the Kosovo War, and even more so the cruise missiles sent into Sudan and Afghanistan in 1998, following the Monica Lewinsky scandal involving Bill Clinton, and of course the current war in Libya. There's a certain impulse which you very, very often see on the Democratic side. It's a reluctance to go to war, but which is conditioned by this fear that the Democrats are going to be basically kind of tarnished with this brush of not being firm and patriotic enough on foreign policy. It's like protesting too much a little bit. LBJ did not want to be seen of as weak, and so therefore he committed US troops to Vietnam. Almost out of a complex more than anything else. So America plunges into this famous commitment in Vietnam, which we'll look at the domestic effects in a couple of weeks. We know the war didn't go well, at least in the sense that the Americans didn't win the war. I mean, tactically, they won all the battles, more or less. But of course, politically and strategically, they eventually lost the war. But it's an interesting microcosm, not just of America's own sort of tarnished and controversial history, but of the way the Cold War, again, intersected with these curiously political anti-colonial disputes. Cuba, in some ways, is an even more interesting example of this, which was simultaneous in some ways to a lot of the events in Vietnam. I mean, there had been a kind of a low-bore guerrilla war fought in the countryside in Cuba in the 1950s. But, I mean, this was not war in the way that Vietnam was war, where you ended up talking about millions and millions of casualties. It was more like a kind of cosmetic, almost spectator war. There was a lot of posturing. Fidel Castro, I mean, we all know about his fatigues and his beard and his speeches and all of that. We don't know that he was actually, like most Cubans, something of an Americanophile. Like almost all Cubans, he played baseball, and he was actually quite good at it. Apparently, he played semi-pro ball for a while, and that's another one of these interesting what-ifs. Had Fidel Castro been drafted by a Major League Baseball team in America, then he wouldn't have eventually become communist dictator. It's quite possible. Castro initially was actually supported by the Americans. I mean, in this sense, the Americans, again, all along, a little bit like with Gem in Vietnam, they have patrons, right? I'm sorry, they have clients. They're the patrons. They have clients. The clients inevitably tend to be corrupt. Americans don't like that. They don't like being seen as the sponsor of some kind of a regime which doesn't respect, dissent and the rights of its people and so on. In this case, it was Batista, who was the latest in a long line of, kind of tin pot pseudo-dictators in Cuba who had been basically propped up by the Americans and continued to be propped up by the Americans, which of course makes sense. Cuba is not just, 90 miles from Miami. I guess in kilometers, that would be, about 140, 150 kilometers away from Miami. But if you looked at Cuba's economy in the 1950s, it was pretty much like 90% tied up with America's economy. The whole thing was American. Famously, of course, if you've watched the Godfather movies, you know about the gambling industry. If you believe the Godfather, they were about to cut some, big new deal with, some of like the big mafia families in America to carve up the Cuban gambling industry. Tourism was obviously very big. Americans went there on holiday all the time. Amazing to remember that today, because of course Americans are now the only country that can't visit Cuba legally. you have to go in like surreptitiously through Mexico or something. But it's just that's where you went. Like in Turkey, you'd go to Bodrum. In America, you'd go to Miami, or if you wanted to be a little more exotic, you'd go to Havana. That was the place. It had been either a protectorate for a time. It had even been a colony briefly after the Spanish-American War. It had basically an American protectorate. Wasn't officially a part of the United States, but in all but the literal sense, it was a part of the American economy and culture. And so, Batista, America had kind of gotten sick of him by this point. In fact, the State Department, they literally issued a communique in 1958 telling him to go. Look, we're sick of you. We're sick of your, corrupt, stinking, fetid dictatorship. We want you to get lost. The New York Times, not just were they running stories against Batista, but they had taken up the cause of the rebels. And Castro, in fact, initially got most of his arms from the Americans. He also got all of his favorable newspaper coverage from the New York Times. And the State Department even had people on the ground who were supporting Castro. It's a curious story. I mean, Che Guevara actually said it, I think, best at one point when he said that, our so-called battles in this little civil war, what mattered a lot more than the number of casualties was whether there was an American journalist following us around. Because the whole thing depended on, newspaper coverage back in the States. The whole thing was kind of, American run, or at the very least, American manipulated, which is what made the outcome so strange. When Castro finally took over and the rebels pour into Havana and Al Pacino leaves on the last plane. I'm sorry, I'm getting this confused with The Godfather Part 2. Have you seen The Godfather Part 2? This is right when he learns that Fredo has betrayed him and he kisses Fredo. But Fredo doesn't go with him. He also tells Fredo he broke his heart. I guess you guys haven't seen The Godfather Part 2. You broke my heart. Well, anyway, so right before Al Pacino, and Fredo and Michael Corleone leave the country. Anyway, so the rebels come in. Batista's, whisked out finally on a plane. And it doesn't seem like that big of a deal. I mean, these kind of like coup d'etats happen in South America all the time. The thing that made it a big deal was simply that Castro decided that he didn't want to become an American client. Remember, you kind of had a choice in the Cold War. And there were like advantages or disadvantages to one side or the other. If you joined the American side, the Americans were richer, so you probably got more money. And a lot of the weaponry might have been more advanced. On the other hand, like if you look at kind of like propaganda and world opinion, there's always a little bit more cachet in being on the Soviet side, or at least being non-aligned. You were on the side of the revolutionaries, on the side of the oppressed, whereas America and the West represented, you might say, sort of like the establishment. Particularly if you were in Cuba. Castro could either be yet another American client tool like Batista, or he could be hero of the global revolution. Well, anyway, he chose the latter. He decided to be a hero of the global revolution. So, essentially, he and his people sent out some feelers to the Soviets. The Soviets said, okay, wow, you're like 90 miles from Miami. This looks promising. So they began, shall we say, a rather serious commitment, which didn't just involve the sending of course, advisors, KGB, money, Soviet supplies, but of course, famously with ballistic missiles, which eventually were to include nuclear warheads. Now, there was a reason for this. Some of it had to do with, internal Soviet politics, Khrushchev posturing for the Politburo. Yeah, and Khrushchev, it was like in his personality. He's the same guy who took his shoe and banged it on the desk at the United Nations. And he was kind of like a rough-hewn peasant who had a little bit of a belligerent streak in him. So some of it was just Khrushchev's personality. But there was a strategic factor. Now, in the 1960 elections, JFK had defeated Nixon, incidentally only by about 50,000 votes. It was a very close election. But anyway, JFK defeated Nixon. Some people said it was because of the advent of television. JFK was, of course, young and handsome. Nixon, much less handsome. Nixon forgot to shave the day before the presidential debate, and so he just didn't look that good in front of the camera. That had something to do with it. But look, the youth age factor was definitely a factor. Eisenhower had been sort of like, grandpa president. He had been kind of like this genial old man. He cultivated this act. Like he was actually not nearly as, senile and grandfatherly as people thought. But he realized this made people underestimate him, so he cultivated it. So, after 8 years with the genial old grandpa, a lot of people thought it'd be great to have this young, vigorous figure in, Kennedy, John F. Kennedy. Well, there was another factor involved in Kennedy's argument for himself. He started talking about, as he put it, getting America moving again. That is, from old age and decrepitude to youth and vigor. Strategically, what he talked about was what he called a missile gap. It's one of these great myths of political history. He claimed that the Soviets were, they were kind of like, had all these plans and leaps and bounds. Their economy was growing faster than ours. They're building more weapons. There is a gap that is developing between our missile capacity. Now, whether or not JFK actually believed this is an interesting question. He may not have been privy to the latest secrets from the intelligence agencies, but in fact, in 1960, America had a 17-to-1 advantage in missile capacity. Mostly because America basically had inherited the better German rocket scientists, and so America's intercontinental ballistic missile system was far more advanced, such that the Soviets basically did not have the capacity to knock out more than several American cities, whereas America could have knocked out virtually the entirety of the industrialized section of the Soviet Union. This is why Cuba mattered. And this is why also, as most of you probably know from your own history, the Americans sold the poor Turks down the river after the Cuban Missile Crisis by withdrawing their own missiles from Turkey. They were, by that point, not that relevant. America had enough intercontinental ballistic missile capacity, as I've said, to rain down hell from the air on the Soviet Union several times over. It did not need the intermediate range missiles in Turkey. The Soviets did need the missiles in Cuba. They needed them because with them, they could reach Washington, New York, Boston, Chicago, etc., which they really couldn't do before. I mean, they claimed that they could, but their technology was not such that they could have guaranteed it. So this basically gave them the ability to wipe out most of American cities in the eastern seaboard. This was significant because if you remember from last week, the basic strategic equation of the early Cold War was this: American nuclear monopoly, then superiority. The Soviets have 3 million troops on the ground in Europe. So as soon as that superiority vanishes, then the Soviets have 3 million troops on the ground in Europe. And America either has to send 3 million troops to Europe or do something to defend Western Europe against Soviet aggression, or America has to begin giving ground on little proxy wars all around the globe. Now, ratcheting up the tension, of course, over the Cuban Missile Crisis was the kind of burgeoning crisis in Berlin, which I should just mention briefly because we're here in the early 60s, the construction of the Berlin Wall in 1961. Now, after the construction of the wall, Kennedy famously went to Berlin and he gave his "I am a jelly donut" speech. No, I'm sorry, he said, "Ich bin ein Berliner," which is grammatically incorrect. You're supposed to say "Ich bin Berliner," but people didn't care. They all clapped and cheered. I mean, he was like sexy. He was a rock star. I mean, people compared Obama to him. There's something to that. But I mean, in Kennedy's era, like, it was all new. You had never had some 40-year-old glamorous, young, handsome politician who's on television and, bestriding the world. I mean, even in France, they loved him. They had this silly little song, they all sang. Like, basically, they counted to 10. 1, 2, 3, 4, 6, and when they got to 10, 10, they said, Kennedy's! Kennedy's! It was really, really goofy. But they had all the school kids in France chanting Kennedy's name. He was like a rock star. So he goes to Berlin and he gives this speech. But here was the thing. Speeches are all fine and good, but speeches did not intimidate the Soviets. They built the wall, and they realized very soon after that Kennedy had not done anything to stop them. I mean, after all, they had just basically built a prison wall around East Berlin. Now, of course, what they claimed was that they put up the wall to keep all those West Berliners from coming into the East, whereas, not true. 3 million East Germans had crossed into West Berlin in the first 13 years of the Cold War. 3 million people had fled from the East to the West. And about 0 had gone in the other direction. So it was a prison wall. It was a blatant act of, shall we say, at the very least, not aggression, but certainly a kind of a finger in the air waved at the West. Kennedy's reaction, yeah, he gave a great speech, but people weren't terribly impressed with the speech. So Khrushchev did not think that Kennedy, yeah, he was a rock star, he was loved, but rock stars who were loved by children do not tend to scare members of the Soviet Politburo. No, famously, actually, they said that when they first met, the first summit, Khrushchev and Kennedy at Vienna, shortly before the Berlin Wall went up, they met at Vienna, and that Khrushchev thought Kennedy was like a child, basically. He was like, who is this? This child, like with his little baby's bottom. He was not impressed. And so he built the Berlin Wall, and then he started stationing the missiles in Cuba. Now, most of you probably know a little bit about how the crisis turned out. There's a more recent movie. Maybe you guys do know this movie reference. 13 Days. You haven't seen that one either? Nobody watched Casablanca. Maybe we could watch 13 Days. Maybe. If we have time. But only if you promise to actually come. Will I show you 13 days? Nobody came to Casablanca. You all sent these emails. So anyway, 13 days, it's not bad. It's a fairly accurate dramatization of the Cuban Missile Crisis, where the basic upshot of it was this. The Kennedys, again, trying to seem tough, which is often a problem for the Democrats who are getting hammered by the Republicans on kind of security issues. They didn't want to just let it happen. On the other hand, they also did not want war. The more belligerent option would have been actually to invade Cuba, or even to knock the missile silos, out from the air. They very nearly did that. In fact, that was basically the option that they first chose a quarantine, which is to say they stopped, further Soviet ships from entering. Then, once that had been done, they ratcheted up the pressure with overflights. But that was really tense because if an American plane were shot down, by an anti-aircraft gun manned by the Soviets, that would seem like basically an act of war. So the Americans were under very strict rules of engagement. A little bit like they would later be in Vietnam, to very ill effect. And things were just getting to be really, really serious when this kind of back-channel message came through from Khrushchev. Weirdly enough, used an old school buddy of his to send an unofficial message to somebody who just knew the Kennedys. It was amazing the way everything happened. Could have very easily gone the other way. When famously the deal was this: the Soviets would remove the missiles. America would, 6 months later, pretending like it was unconnected, remove its own missiles from Turkey, which were, again, more or less obsolete by that point, selling out the poor Turks. But then America also promised not to invade Cuba. Now that's interesting, because you might kind of think that having the leader of the world revolution 90 miles from Miami for the next... God, he's still around, isn't he? He's still there. It's amazing. He's been there longer than Gaddafi. It's extraordinary. He's been in power for 50 years. Okay, he's sort of a vegetable now, but he's still there. So that was the price America paid. Yes, they diffused the crisis, but at the cost of basically 50 years of propaganda right in their backyard. And it wasn't just propaganda. If you know another Al Pacino movie, which you probably don't, Scarface. Yes, this is a classic. They also, periodically, would just release violent criminals and send them to America, which, including, of course, Al Pacino's character in Scarface. The Cubans were, shall we say, a thorn in America's side for the next 50 years. So the Soviets did exact a certain price. Now, it's not that America necessarily had to do everything they promised, but implicit in all these deals between the superpowers was this. If America promises this and then America doesn't do that, the Soviets would, of course, retaliate. So Cuba had essentially been now internationalized as officially a communist state. I didn't even mention the Bay of Pigs, but that was a disaster. It was initially begun, the planning under Eisenhower. So he kind of kicked the can over to Kennedy. The real problem was that Kennedy sent these 3,000 exiles with no air support and essentially no logistical support from the Americans onto a beach in Cuba, where they're, of course, immediately annihilated or rounded up and arrested. The reason he didn't give air support and he didn't send troops was because he wanted the world to think America wasn't involved. You see, in a paramilitary operation against Castro 90 miles from Miami, he wanted the world to think that America wasn't involved. Well, I have to say, he did at least learn enough so that by the time of the Cuban Missile Crisis, he did not back down entirely. He did stand up to the Soviets to some extent. But signaling weakness was always very dangerous in these sorts of proxy wars. It is true the CIA did have a couple of plans to assassinate Castro. Famously, one of them, they were going to set fire to his beard. You've heard that story. Some of these stories, they sound too preposterous to be true, but they're actually true, apparently. So, they had various plans, yes, to assassinate Castro, but they didn't come to anything. So this story, again, it could be pitched in different ways. Cuba like Vietnam. Is it a anti-colonialist story? Yeah, there's something to that. But inevitably, all of these struggles in the Cold War got subsumed into this larger sort of campaign, like a proxy battle in this global ideological struggle, which I think to some extent really distorted their meaning, or at least distorted their understanding. To where I remember growing up, just as a kid looking at the map of the world, and it was this extremely well-organized thing, right? Everything was like these nice, neat blocks. You were in the second world, that was the Soviet bloc. Or you were in the first world, or you were in the non-aligned third world. And there are all these very, very nicely delineated borders with all of these states, only half of which still exist today. I think some people are nostalgic for the Cold War, partly because it did give this political clarity to things, which maybe they didn't really have. I mean, one Cuban dissident, I think he summed it up best when he was describing Castro's regime. He was one of these Cuban dissidents who ended up in Miami, like most of them did. And he said, well, that's the thing, is like he got admired as this great hero. A little bit like Che Guevara becomes international symbol of revolution. I mean, that's ridiculous. Che Guevara was an executioner. I mean, he literally personally supervised executions in a big stadium. At least like 3,000 of them were killed in one day. He was a brutal, brutal man who got romanticized into global hero. But the thing is, like, what kind of revolutionary was he really? This is what the guy said. Once you declared yourself a communist, it was like opening a McDonald's franchise. Right? The Soviets sent in the KGB, they sent in the political advertisers, they told you what to do, they sent you the money, they sent you the arms, they helped you organize your secret police. Basically, it was like opening a franchise. Yes, the other side, you could say, was like a similar franchise. But on the American side, there was a little more variety. The Soviet side, you eventually got the same drab regimes everywhere, with the same secret police, the same surveillance, the same censorship, the same land reform, the same nationalization of agriculture, and in the end, of course, the same economic stagnation and or famine. The most curious thing of all, if you look at a place like Cuba, was this. Supposedly, communism was all about the vanguard. Remember, it was about the future and progress. Cuba is basically still stuck in the 1950s. If you go there, all the cars are from like 1955. I mean, it's amazing. So instead of accelerating the development of history, in some peculiar way, I think communism almost froze things in time. So where if you go to former communist countries today, it's a little bit like stepping back into a time warp. Life is slower. Technology is less advanced. People still live in very old-fashioned ways. In curious ways, I think actually what we might call kind of traditional, family values have actually been better preserved in some of these communist countries, simply because they never prospered and they never progressed anywhere. They're still stuck in the past. So there are lots of ironies, lots of things to focus on when we look at the Cold War. I think that's all I had for today. We're not going to do class on Friday. That's because none of you will be here anyway, I assume. So we'll pick up again on Wednesday. Now, any of you who are interested in your scores on the midterm? No, oh yes. I do have your scores. If you want to look at your exams, you'll have to come by my office. But if you want to just take a brief look at your scores, these are out of 50. I mean, eventually, you didn't have to take sides in the sense you didn't have to absolutely officially say, I am on the communist side or I'm on the American side in the Cold War. But usually momentum would push you in one direction or the other. And for the most part, the anti-colonial direction would push you into the Soviet camp. Which, again, when you first think about it, should be ironic because America was the great anti-imperial power. That's how it saw itself. America did not like the British and French empires. America, as we just saw, basically stood up to Britain and France at Suez. That said, it was more often true than not that the anti-American side in the Cold War, the anti-Western side, would just end up on the Soviet side either by default or, of course, because it wanted the weapons or it wanted the financing. I mean, to some extent, the Cold War, it was a boom key countries because, after all, we can't focus on everything. Vietnam, obviously, being a biggie. Now, Vietnam, again, was part of a French colony. The French, of course, called it Indochine, or Indochina. It was not split into these three countries we know today of Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia until 1950, and then by the French, who were trying to kind of reclassify everything in order to shore up the administrative, you might say, oomph of their empire, to try to legitimize these states as part of the French, their own version of the Commonwealth. It wasn't going well, though. Ho Chi Minh was there, Again, perched mostly in the north, in Hanoi, later Ho Chi Minh City, or no, that's Saigon, sorry, in Hanoi. So Ho Chi Minh is up there in the north. He's pretty much in the communist side. Again, the debate was, to what extent is he just a nationalist guerrilla leader who wants to kick out the West? To what extent? All right. To some extent, this whole story has to dovetail inevitably with the Cold War. It's not that they're separate subjects exactly. I mean, they intersect in fascinating ways. But you could also chalk up this entire period in history, even something like the Chinese Civil War, to a kind of decolonization. I mean, after all, when Mao took power, if we remember from last week, Chiang Kai-shek and his forces, the Kuomintang, fled to Taiwan. They hadn't just been backed by the Americans and the West writ large. To some extent, they'd even been backed by the Soviets. Mao, remember, had not really been Stalin's first choice. I mean, Stalin would have been happy to see China divided. So part of what gave Mao time, for would-be guerrilla leaders and tin pot dictators everywhere. Because just think of the rewards if you went on the payroll. I mean, Cuba, by the end of the 1980s, was getting almost $5 billion a year from the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union, mind you. A basket case of a country that had no toilet paper. They were sending the Cubans $5 billion a year. I mean, it's an extraordinary commitment of resources and prestige. But that's what the Cold War was like. Massive excess and waste on both sides. When you think about the cost of putting a man on the moon, it was insane. It made no logical sense. It was all about, prestige. To some extent, all these proxy battles were like that too. They didn't start that way, though. There are a lot of different ground we could cover, ground we could skip. I mean, I'll just focus on some of his momentum, was this whole impetus, this thing I talked about last week. The best word for it, I think, is hesperophobia, just this idea of an almost reaction, a lashing back at the West against foreigners, which in China would basically assume extreme forms by the 1960s in the course of the Cultural Revolution. But that's next week's subject. You could chalk up a lot of these other stories, too, to the Cold War, or you could see them as part of the story of decolonization. Cuba would be a good example, where, of course, we know the drama of the Cuban Missile Crisis. But to some extent, the Castro phenomenon, again, represented a casting off of the West, or at least of the Americans. It's true he went in with the Soviets, and so he didn't become non-aligned like some of these other would-be dictators at the Bandung Conference. But there was an element of an anti-Western impulse there. It was usually the case that even the non-aligned countries